Somewhere in America, inside a building most people have never heard of, a staff member kept a drawer full of wedding rings. Not for weddings. They were handed to unmarried, pregnant teenagers. For one afternoon, a ring let them walk outside looking like someone's wife instead of someone's secret. You've heard the sanitized version of this story, a girl who went to stay with an aunt. That phrase was doing a lot of hiding. By the end of this video, you'll understand how a family could have a child who simply stopped existing in conversation. Not died, not left, just stopped being mentioned. A quiet street 1958. A house behind a hedge. Curtains drawn, no name on the mailbox. The neighbors know exactly what's happening inside. They've just agreed, without ever saying so, never to ask. Now zoom out. That one house was never the whole story. More than 200 houses like it operated at the same time in 44 states. Together, they absorbed around 25,000 young women a year. A nationwide network. And almost nobody alive today has ever heard its name. The baby scoop era. Inside, identity got erased first. Residents were often stripped of their real names on arrival, handed an alias. Even the woman in the next bed couldn't carry her actual story home with her. When residents were allowed outside, staff reached into that drawer. They handed over a wedding ring. Wear it. Look married. Return it by dinner. That's the drawer from the opening of this video. Not a kindness. A prop, checked out like a costume because looking respectable mattered more than being honest. And the world outside those hedges wasn't gentler. Some residents, walking those streets in borrowed rings, were met with jeers, thrown fruit, punished in public simply for being visibly pregnant and unmarried. Here's why it got this big, this fast. Abortion was a crime, punishable by prison, in nearly every state until the very end of the 1960s. Strip away every option but one, and that option stops being a choice. It becomes a pipeline. A pipeline needs more than buildings, though. It needs people trained to keep it running. Here's what almost nobody knows. This wasn't just cultural pressure working quietly in the background. There was a script, a real one, published, taught. By the late 1950s, social workers who specialized in unwed motherhood were writing instructions for each other, step-by-step guidance, how to move a terrified young woman towards surrendering her child. One journal article carried a title that reads almost like a job posting, helping a mother surrender her child for adoption. Strip away the clinical tone and what's left is a persuasion technique. Refined, tested, taught case by case the way a company trains its best closers, and it worked, not occasionally, almost universally. By the mid-1960s, unwed mothers were supplying up to 9 out of every 10 adoptable infants in the entire country. 9 out of 10. This wasn't coincidence, repeated thousands of times. It was engineered before these women had even finished unpacking their suitcase. So when a family said, years later, she gave the baby up, a trained professional had simply done her job. And decades later, one government finally admitted it in writing. In 2018, a Canadian Senate committee investigated its own country's version of this system. Their word for it, shrouded in secrecy, for nearly 30 years. An institution enforces silence with case files and closed doors. A family doesn't need any of that. Sometimes all it needs is silence at the dinner table. Picture the 1950s household the way it's usually sold to you. Cash on the counter, zero debt, every dollar earned outright, comforting image, mostly fiction. By 1956, nearly half of American households were carrying installment debt. Furniture, cars, appliances, all financed piece by piece behind a freshly painted front door. Then, in 1958, a bank did something that sounds almost fictional today. It mailed out thousands of fully active credit cards, completely unsolicited, to households that had never applied for one. No application, no credit check, just a working card in the mailbox, and a debt engine now quietly running in a house that looked, from the sidewalk, like it had everything figured out. Here's the picture worth holding on to. A father, carving a Sunday roast, bought on credit, at a table bought on credit, wearing a suit paid off one installment at a time, playing the role of a man who'd already made it when the paperwork said otherwise. Nobody at that table was technically lying, they just weren't saying the other half of the truth. And a whole generation of kids grew up believing that gap between image and reality simply didn't exist. Because at home, it was never once mentioned out loud. That's what a family can hide on its own, with nothing but silence and a mortgage. What some men brought home from the war, silence alone couldn't cover. That took 35 years to even get a name. Try this. Come home from the most violent thing a human being can survive. Now get handed an unspoken instruction manual. Don't mention it, get a job. Rebuild the marriage, move on, and move on quietly. That was the deal for millions of returning World War II veterans, whether anyone ever said it to their faces or not. An estimated 4 in every 10 wartime medical discharges were for psychiatric conditions. Doctors at the time called it combat fatigue, and almost none of these men ever talked about what caused it. Not with friends, not with their wives, almost never with their own kids. Here's the number that should stop you. What we now call PTSD wasn't recognized as a diagnosis until 1980, 35 years after the war ended. 35 years these men carried something real, something that rewired how their bodies reacted to a slammed door, a car backfiring, a hand on the shoulder. No clinical name for it, no permission to say a word. One son described his father keeping a mental drawer sealed shut for life, labeled with the exact date the war in Europe ended, never opened again in front of his children. Their wives learned to read the silence the way you'd read weather rolling in, which subjects were safe, which moods meant the house needed to go quiet. Their kids absorbed all of it without ever hearing why, not through words, through instinct, knowing exactly which doors not to knock on. It took until 1990, decades after these men had become grandfathers for VA centers, to see a sudden wave of elderly veterans finally asking for help. The war never actually ended in 1945, it just went underground and waited. That drawer of rings, from the start of this video, every single one was tracked, numbered, checked out, and checked back in. Inventory, not humanity. 3 secrets, 1 shape underneath. A pregnant teenager threatened the family's reputation. An institution absorbed her and erased her name. A family in debt threatened the illusion of success. So they financed the lie and said nothing. A traumatized father threatened the image of the unshakable provider. So an entire culture simply agreed not to ask. No villain required anywhere in this. Just thousands of frightened, ordinary people doing exactly what an entire society had trained them to do. Protect the image, whatever the truth costs. But there's one more version of this machine, the one running at full power. This time, what it swallowed wasn't a fact, wasn't a debt, wasn't a memory. It was a person. This is what I promised you at the start. Researchers spent years combing through more than 150 personal memoirs from this era. What they found goes further than anything you've heard so far. Families raising a child with a physical or intellectual disability didn't hide that child the way you'd hide a debt or a war wound. They institutionalized them, sent them away for good, and then simply stopped saying their name, not occasionally, in hushed tones once a year, completely, permanently. Some brothers and sisters, interviewed decades later as grown adults, described the exact moment they learned something, that they'd once had a sibling. Not a rumor, not a half-suspicion carried since childhood. A hard, plain fact erased so thoroughly that an entire childhood passed without it ever surfacing. Birthdays, holidays, 1,000 ordinary dinners, nothing. Sit with that. This wasn't one lie, told once and left alone. It was a daily act of omission, repeated for a lifetime. A name, never spoken again. A birthday, never marked. A chair, never visibly empty because as far as those children knew, it had never been filled at all. The same instinct behind the borrowed wedding rings. The same instinct behind the financed illusion of success. The same instinct that sealed a father's war behind a drawer for 35 years. Here, it reached its absolute limit. It stopped hiding a fact about a person. It hid the person, because his existence said something about the family, something the culture around them had decided simply couldn't be said out loud. That family believed silence would protect them. But a secret this size doesn't stay buried, not anymore. None of these families saw themselves as liars. They believed they were protecting each other, from judgment, from shame, from a culture that had no room for anything less than perfection. That's what makes this so hard to simply call dishonesty. Right now, DNA tests are quietly undoing what decades of silence built, reconnecting mothers with children they never stopped wondering about, surfacing names families thought were buried for good. One woman spent 25 years searching for the mother she'd lost and found siblings she never even knew existed. So before you close this, what did your family never talk about, and did you ever find out why?